Hello, all, and welcome to the MMR on the Air podcast. I am Matt,
I am Lauren.
I'm Christian.
And I'm James.
and we are here for the first episode of the fall 2021 semester. And if you don't know, we are in More Media Records here at Central Michigan University, and our club meets on Thursday nights at 6 p.m. in Moore Hall, room 182. And with that, you can come hang out, you can come learn how to record music, talk about music, advertise music, or if you just love music and want cool people to talk to, that's what we're for, because our job is talking. And
Come
speaking
on
of talking to
down.
music, Lauren has a great topic for this week.
So I am a fan of indie music. I don't know about you guys, but I
Heck
really
yeah.
like indie rock,
fan, yeah.
particularly. Big fan. We had planned to do an album review of sorts and talk about the general topic of the genre that this album fits in. And so the album definitely fits in indie rock. It would be considered, in my opinion, one of the most classic indie rock albums of the early 2000s. And so I just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about indie rock and
You gonna keep us in suspense?
well, I don't know. I was thinking
Ooh.
about it. I was just thinking about it. We're gonna talk about Good News for People Who Love Bad News by Modest Mouse. It's a great one. It's probably one of my top 10. And I always recommend people should check it out because it just really opened me up to a lot of different music that I never expected to like. And it really was something for me as a young
Yeah.
indie folk.
Well, so for me, I always wondered, right, when I hear indie music, what I think of is, coffee house vibes, like no one knows who this is. Like, why should I care if no one knows who this is? But Modest Mouse, after this album, was huge. I remember Float On was playing all the time, and in high school, my friends, like, anytime I was in the car, he had this album or one of their albums, and it was always just a great time listening to it. So what I'm wondering is, though, right, can you define something as indie music? Because once you become big, you're no longer independent. You have, multiple labels, you have a tour, you have people that you're hiring to present your music. So then does it change genres, or was it never indie music to begin with? Is indie just, I haven't made it yet?
Well, I think indie is more of like a sound than it is anything else. I mean, you can have a specific like vibe to an album and still have it be indie without them actually being like on their own and not with the label, you know?
I totally agree now. Back when this was released, it was a big deal for this indie artist of sorts. I mean, they were signed at this point. But because it gained such mainstream attractions and attentions, it almost became like something that you couldn't admit to really liking anymore because it was popular and you don't want to be a poser. Why would you ever want to be a poser? And so like, oh, you like Good News? That's lame. I don't know if you've ever heard of their first stuff or their unreleased stuff, but like that stuff way better than this. I don't know what you're talking about. So I think like back in the early 2000s and definitely in the 90s, indie music had this real tangible like title to it. You're indie if you put in the work and you didn't get signed and you genuinely put everything that you had and the band had into just making music for yourself and for your audience, and not for the labels, not for the big companies, but instead for like a very small group of people.
Exactly. I mean, well, to what I'm getting you're saying is, because I've never been a huge fan of quote unquote indie music, but what I'm confused on is indie, would you say it's like, right, and comparing it to food, like say, oh, it's Italian food, like, right, like it's a rock music, has a very defined sound, very defined instruments, kind of like overall song structure, like pop as well, hip hop? Or would you say indie is like paprika, where it's like, or like cinnamon, where you're like, ooh, like this is totally its own thing, but it's a strong sense of cinnamon. You know what I'm saying when it comes to genre?
Yeah, I
Like,
mean,
is this some other kind of rock as well as indie, or is it what you know put your stake down, say this is indie?
like Christian was saying, I think I agree with you on the terms of like now it is based in sound. I feel like the younger generation associates indie music with a certain sound and not a certain moral standing in terms of releasing music. Do you know what I mean?
Well, and I think also, like, I've noticed a lot, even Spotify will categorize it as a different genre, and there's, like, indie folk and, like, indie rock and, like, that kind of stuff, but there's also just separate folk and rock and like that kind of stuff. And I also think that indie music as a sound, I wonder almost if it becomes like popular music if the sound makes it indie, but the status doesn't, and where that line is.
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
get that.
I would think that indie music would just be like experimental in a way, just like trying to change things up in a different way, like trying to highlight like that's how new artists stand out from each other. That's how we find all these new artists because their stuff is unique.
So really, independent just means the beginnings, because when you're a band trying to make it out right, they don't want to hear the same stuff they've been hearing. They want to hear your take on it. So like when I think of, a lot of artists when I look at their early stuff, a lot of the times it's very most like avant-garde, like what you're saying, artistic, kind of very, they're trying to push it out there and make more of a stamp than they are trying to make more of a poppy, really catchy album.
Right.
So, it's,
And you can even, talk about their progression, Modest Mouse as a band, their progression from those early albums onto what they have just released now, and how some of it may be considered to be washed out or, less potent and exciting and very Modest Mousey.
Yeah, so-
Do you know what
Mhm.
I mean?
So I guess the real also big question is, when would you say this definition of indie music started? Because I would think back to like, probably the early 90s. Of course, one of the most influential bands, Nirvana, they basically made the genre grunge. And from there, you could say like, oh, this at the time, they're like, oh, this is just a different kind of rock. But they weren't defined as indie. Would you say, you know, not to mention the time that Modest Mouse came out, probably like, late 90s, early 2000s, the beginning of the internet, would you say kind of that rise in a new way of, musical bands hit their hit their audience? Would you say that, kind of how they reach their audience makes them indie, right? Being this kind of social status too, like, oh, I knew them before they were cool, right? Or, oh,
Yeah.
I've, have this sticker that they made and they put it on their MySpace.
Right. I mean, it's hard to say when the term exactly got its like real movement going. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Indie is something that I feel like, especially growing up in the 2000s, just seems like it's gone on forever. Indie music is
Yeah.
the music. You know what I mean? Like, I felt like I truly understood music when I started appreciating and liking indie music. But what kind of indie music was it? Like we were debating whether that is in the title or in the sound itself. You
Right.
know what I mean? So it's hard to exactly locate the spot in time in which indie
It's
music
not
got
being
its
told.
It's
You
definitely
said
a
Yeah.
gradual change, I think, that like it just kind of happened while nobody was looking, and then it was just there.
right.
That's kind of how it felt like for me. Like I went through the same experience where I like was listening to all sorts of music, and once I started listening to indie music, like I started connecting with music a lot. And yeah, I mean that transition like from learning that it existed and like kind of looking back on the history, it really was like gradual as far as I can tell.
Right. And then we can get into like the separation of the different kinds of indie music. You know, there's indie punk, indie rock, indie folk, indie. There's just so many different kinds. And I almost feel like indie folk is just folk. You know what I mean?
Right.
Because folk music to me screams independent.
Right.
Folk music to me says, I'm
There's
making
not
this
a
for
lot
my
of,
Very
like,
audience.
personal.
Super
Yeah.
popular like pop music, folk music.
Right, right.
You
know?
always, yeah.
So I think it's cool how it's gotten separated into those different sections. You know what I mean? And somehow I find that most people that listen to indie music have dipped their toe into every single one of
Yeah.
those and, seen what indie punk looks like, indie rock, indie, all of that
I would
stuff.
say that it's like very hard to define indie music like as a single like point of example, And I think that if it kind of came about like in the same way that alternative came about, like people just wanted something different, like another outlet for the same type of music, And it's really hard to pinpoint, but it's really hard to define, sorry, but like I feel like it when you see it, you know?
Mhm. Definitely. And I think
So
this
it's a
album,
vibe.
It's a
Oh, it's a
vibe.
vibe.
It's
It
a
is
vibe.
yeah.
did it pass the vibe check? The indie
It
vibe
did.
check?
And-
Indie vibe check.
That's a big question I was wondering too, because for me, a lot of artists I find, in the beautiful, wonderful world of the internet it is today, I'll go on Spotify, I'll find, maybe 5 artists I really like, and of course, I got them on repeat, and then the Discover Weekly comes out for me. I'm like, "Oh, well, awesome, let's check this out. I wanna find new stuff." And when I often find it, I would say sometimes I find ones with 10,000 listeners every month, maybe like most up to 50, maybe 100,000. And to me, I think that's still fairly, I wouldn't say independent, but I would say not mainstream, right? Where big, pop groups like Billie Eilish has like 500,000, like 500 million. And, that's where you would say that is popular, regardless of the genre, popular. But I wouldn't necessarily define a lot of those groups as quote unquote indie. I mean, I think with the vibe that you're talking about, with indie being important, having like kind of like it's a thing to say, like it's more than just the music. It's like the clothes I'm wearing when I'm listening to it. Like for me, when I think of this time of early 2000s, I was still buying CDs at Best Buy.
Right.
You remember
Mm.
back when you could
Yep.
listen to the
Right.
samples?
Yeah.
And the dude would be
Uh-huh.
like, dude, you've been here for like 40 minutes. Come on. You can't just listen to the whole thing. And I'm like, come on, please.
I was just enjoying myself.
Yeah. And I would just find, I'd be like, okay, well, I'll try this artist because I really like them, or, let's give it a shot. And I was stuck with the album, and I was like, regardless, ride or die, I'm going to listen to it. And if I love it, I'm going to love all of it,
Right. Yeah. I think that this whole indie thing is such an interesting topic to talk about. And the first thing that always comes to mind when I think of indie artists that don't really feel indie to me is like, no hate, no shame, but Clairo. People claim is an industry
Yeah.
plant. She's, very, very popular, like well known and liked, especially with the growth of social media like TikTok.
Mhm.
She has become one of the most iconic indie artists, as we say. But was she ever really indie to start with? I think she was. Didn't she make something in her bedroom? I'm not super familiar with her
I
work.
mean, Justin Bieber did as
No,
well. So
I mean-
Right, exactly. But is he
So is he-
indie?
Yeah.
I would
so
definitely
is Lauren.
define her early career as indie. I mean, she was making like bedroom pop before a lot of like indie pop artists really came onto the scene.
Right.
Which I mean, and obviously being like a prominent like female like voice, like she had a lot of influence in the early like indie pop scene. But I feel like gradually as her music evolved, she kind of evolved with it, and she had to take that step into the mainstream to just continue her career. Because like as an indie artist, what's the goal? Is it your goal to stay indie forever and stay not in the mainstream, or do you want to break into that?
Right.
Well, at some point, right, like, I guess my whole argument is saying if her music sounds the same, then she didn't change her genre. It just changed her status.
Yeah.
Like, if I think of, like Taylor Swift, right, for example, I would define her as a multifaceted kind of artist where, right, her growing up, she was really big into country. She loved her playing her guitar and singing songwriting. That was her main thing. And then as she grew, she felt like she's like, well, I've done this. I want to do more. And I want, even if, it's not what my listeners expect of me or what, might be the best play as far as like, as a business, let's be real here. The music genre is still business. She went off on that, and, she did a lot of pop. She did a lot of like more folk stuff. But to her, she's still Taylor Swift. She's still like the biggest thing out there. So
Yeah, I think growth comes with that. I think there's a level of understanding within fan bases of indie artists, though, where you almost know if it seems like a sellout. If the next album drop
betrayed.
is
Oh.
completely like
Mhm.
different than what you were expecting, it doesn't even feel like the band had anything to do with it, then it's, there's still that level of indie culture where people want it to be genuine and real and for the audience and not for the general public. You know what I mean? I think that's still a part of indie culture, but it's not as intense anymore because I feel like people are really into the idea of progressing with your sound. I feel like nowadays, pop artists even are like really just progressing with their sound and making
Right.
things completely different on each album because that's what the general public desires,
Well, and there's also, there's that really important separation between like the listeners can tell if music is made from the emotion of the artist versus like to make money. And it's really interesting that you bring that up in terms of like indie music versus like other types of music. Cause like I feel like a lot of indie music connects to listeners also like on an emotional level in a way that pop music or like even just like any type of music that's just kind of factory generated, I guess, like doesn't really connect as much. And I feel like that's part of the indie genre that we're kind of throwing back and forth is like it does connect on an emotional level because it's not for mainstream. And so like it's so interesting also because we're talking about indie artists like getting popular and then can we call them indie artists anymore? It's a lot easier, I think, in some ways to get popular as an indie artist, especially through like TikTok and stuff. Because people will just grab audio from the songs and then, somebody wants to hear the whole song and then suddenly you've got,
Yep. If
10,000
8
listeners.
seconds is good,
Yeah.
then the whole song is good. Now
Right.
with the internet,
Right.
especially with, such high-paced movement
Mhm.
and traffic of different types of music on TikTok
Right.
especially. TikTok is like a crazy place to be
It's
right now for
I mean,
insane,
music.
yeah.
you see a lot of artists nowadays like specifically tailoring their music like to TikTok.
Right.
And I mean that I mean at least for me, I think that kind of causes some concern because I feel like it's kind of like just not reaching its full potential then.
Yeah.
I kind of agree with you. I mean, we were talking about this earlier, but like, who listens to whole albums anymore? I mean,
Yeah.
our generations, I know we range in age ever so slightly, but we're between the like 18 and 22 range, I would say probably, right? So I feel like we've grown up with this generation of oversaturated stimulation in terms of social media, in terms of the internet, in terms of everything. And people are just so ready to consume small bits of content instead of an overall larger picture. And whole albums provide such a beautiful and different quality than, short format
Yeah,
media.
I mean,
But
it's honestly a shame. I mean, the way an album can actually like tell a story, and even concept albums, like it really takes away from the art. I feel like,
Yeah.
and
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 I was just gonna say, like albums, if you listen to them in order, it's kind of like how musicals are set up, but they're set up in an order that often tells a story. And I think a lot of people do miss out on that. I know I myself included, I don't listen to a lot of full albums, but when I do and when I find the time to, there is a lot of like importance in listening to the songs in order because they're put there for a reason, a lot of the time. And if they're not, then, it's really unfortunate. For me personally, like I really enjoy when albums have their songs set up in a certain way that like it tells a story or it just makes sense in an order,
It tells
like
a vibe.
a progression.
Because the
Yeah.
big thing with me was me being a classic rock fan, either when they made an album, right, you had side A and side B. So a big part would be you want the first song to really catch them. And then when it fades out of side A, like I think of classic example is Abbey Road. It does the She's So Heavy and it literally goes until it's like ear screeching pain and then silence. And then the next song is Here Comes the Sun. And the main reason that was on side B is because they're like, well, this is like the best song ever. So let's put it on the side so people can just play it immediately.
yeah, and it's a
Yeah.
beautiful juxtaposition
Yeah,
too. If
even
you're
if it's-
listening
it
to
is.
it all the way through, it
It's
flows
perfect. Yeah.
perfectly. And I think this album in particular, I like the way that things are placed. I like the order in which the album tracking goes. I did do some research before this podcast, watched a few other people do reviews on it, and people had some beef with the way that this album was laid out.
Ooh.
Really?
Yeah, people thought that certain songs should go in different spots, and I see what they were saying because they did have a similar vibe. Like, in particular, I saw someone say that Satin Coffin should be between Buckowski and Devil's Workday. And that's because they have a very similar vibe. But I think that it's nice to spread out that vibe a little bit throughout the album. And that's why I liked where it was placed by the artist
Yeah, and-
themselves. You know
yeah,
what I mean?
I mean, I would say this to end on the whole albums kind of like having weight with that, right? Christian before said about like a concept album, right? It tells a story, right? And that is obviously you can't play that shuffle. But what's also a big thing is what we're going to also touch upon in the next segment here with this album, Good News for People Who Love Bad News, is it's almost like section groupings, right? You'll hear a lot of times people say A sides or B sides, what I just mentioned. or C and D sides if it's a long album. And that kind of goes into what they think the listeners might want to hear, and yes, and how they group. So, how about you guys? I'm so excited to go into this album.
My favorite. Well, not necessarily top
she's playing favorites
favorite,
now.
but it is one of my favorites. And I'm so excited to be able to review this. I was like ready. As soon as I knew podcast was getting back, I was like, I really, really want to review this album because over this past summer, I feel like I just dove deep right back into this album and remembered why I loved it so much. So like the first 3 tracks, do we want to talk about those in a segment? Because I feel like they really fit in a segment we were talking
What's the
about.
best way here? I feel like you're the maestro here.
Okay.
This is your magnum opus.
Was
so
that a pun?
the best.
Maestro.
Oh.
That's nice.
The
Modest
Maestro.
Mice, yeah.
Maestro.
Well, okay, we could talk about them individually. There's
Intro song, easily the best one.
yeah,
Oh,
Horns
yeah.
intro,
Horns
like
intro.
the 9-second little intro there.
4,000 plays.
Yeah.
On Spotify.
We were looking at that. All of the songs that are like intro or little interludes have only like 3,000 views versus the rest of them have like hundreds of thousands, which is
Millions. Literally millions.
crazy.
You're
Which
just
I
like,
think only 4,000 people have listened to this album all the way
That's
through.
Yeah.
that's exactly what I was gonna
yeah,
say.
I
that's
think
very
it's a
disappointing
I
because
think the people have it in their cars on the CD from way back when.
right,
Honestly.
right. This time wasn't the time of Spotify. This was the time of CDs. This was the time of cassettes. It's a beautiful album though. I love the horns intro because I'm a sucker for a good horn. I play trumpet. I love it, and it got me like excited to listen to this album again. And then it goes right into The World at Large, which The World at Large, then Float On. Those are their 2 really big songs that got like well recognized by the general public, and kind of brought them out of the indie world and into the like mainstream world. So
And they flow so well together.
they are
do.
beautiful.
The
They do.
transitions are insane on these 2
Oh,
songs.
beautiful. It is
It's great.
so stunning. And The World at Large to me screams walking around in the wintertime and looking at the snow. And it makes me feel like I'm the main character, and it does
already
all
got
the
chills.
things that I want it to do for me. And I just love that track. It was, I believe, the first Modest Mouse song I ever heard, which is surprising that it wasn't Float On, because that is their most popular song. But The World at Large, someone showed me it back in middle school, and I ran with it. I loved that song. I did not check out the rest of the album, though. And hear me out, I didn't check it out until high school. I think that if I would have checked this album out in middle school, I probably would have been just unbearable as a person because I would have thought I was better than everyone.
Yeah,
I
fair
would have
enough, fair
thought
enough.
that I just knew things that people didn't. I was already on that pipeline listening to Cage the Elephant at like age
Oh my
12. And so
So,
if I would have had Modest Mouse under my belt too, I feel like I would have just been like, you don't get it. This
Here-
is my show and you're all just the background characters.
Here
But
I was listening to Young Gravy at 18.
yeah, well, I mean, you're here now.
I do feel like sometimes albums just come to you like at a time that you're ready to listen to them, and
Yeah.
it's
Oh,
weird
totally.
that way. Like that happens sometimes.
and it's great how it's like
Definitely.
combined with that memory, because I don't know about you, Float On, the first time that I like really heard it and loved it was honest to God, Rock Band 2. Anyone?
Oh my
Rock Band
god,
2,
Rock Band 2!
yes.
That was like one of the first
Oh
ones
my
I was like
gosh.
trying to master on drums. Like, okay, this one isn't too hard, and it's like the most like chugging, catchy beat. And I think what's big about, also I want to say about the first couple tracks is it sets the vibe up for also the sound. Because for me, like when they singing Float On, you just can't help but sing the chorus with it.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
You,
So
it
true.
feels like an anthem song. It
Mhm.
feels like a pub song. It's just so
And
catchy.
I mean, oh, sorry, go ahead. Okay, so going back to that, that I
The
don't know,
gang vocals. The gang
yeah.
vocals.
The
What I
gang
was gonna
vocals,
say is the
yeah.
gang vocals on that makes it feel like a pub song.
Yeah.
I am a good punk friend. I love punk, and so gang vocals get me hype.
Yeah.
And so that on Float On
I just couldn't
really.
help but steering wheel drum, and because I listened to this in the car, I couldn't help but hit my steering wheel. The windshield was the cymbals, and then just I had to sing it because I just had to. It reminded me of a great time, just at any just with music.
Have you guys ever heard the Kanye mix with Float On?
I haven't.
no, but I have
Oh,
to hear this.
It comes in, bana, let's get lost tonight. We can put-
Oh,
it's so
no
good.
way.
It's
Oh my
so
gosh.
good. I'll have to show you after, but it's so good.
I'm so interested
And
in this.
you would never expect those two to go well together. Totally do. So Float On, World at Large, I think those were their two biggest tracks, and then it moves into Ocean Breathe Salty, which is a little bit of a slowdown in my opinion, even though World at Large and Float On are pretty slow for the album because this album does get pretty crazy at certain points. But Ocean Breathe Salty, I really like this song in terms of lyrical content. I just always thought that it was beautiful and super poetic.
And what a title.
Yeah.
I mean, that, like, just the imagery that the title provokes
Yeah.
is so nice.
And
I actually really like this track too. I thought they had more of like a Strokes feel.
yes.
Like, I mean,
Yes.
of their first album, Is This It? And a heavy 2000s vibe.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
I know it was like made in the 2000s, but this has got to be the influence for all that stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Like the like trilling synths in the back and stuff. It's
Mhm.
just classic.
Yeah, I definitely agree.
And like with the vocals, it reminded me a lot. I think it was this song. When I went to go, my friends had last minute tickets to see, well, it was Modest Mouse and who was the one that did The Devil and God Are Raging Inside Me?
Brand new?
Brand New. Yeah, it was that
Yeah,
concert.
Good concert. Wish I
Like
could've
when
been.
I heard his vocals, I'm like, oh, this is a lot like Brand New. It's like the kind of
Mhm.
like, really, it's kind of like this angsty feel. So definitely the first bit of the album has that rocker, like kind of like post punk, very.
Early 2000s, man.
Yeah.
Give me that early
But
2000s.
I still I feel like it still has that like slower, like more digestible like feel to it, you know? So it wasn't like as heavy as the earlier stuff.
Yeah, I agree with these first 3 full songs. I think that it's the perfect introduction to this album because it gives people a little easy slide into what soon will be Isaac Brock screaming into the microphone
Which is a
in
great
very
way to
scary
start
tones.
that, by the way.
Yeah, now let's start screaming about death. And apparently this album in a whole is about death and the afterlife. I gathered that, probably like 6 or 7 times into my listen through of this album because I'm a little thick in the school
You're too busy,
sometimes.
you're
but-
too busy headbanging.
Yeah,
It-
too
it
busy
is-
enjoying
is-
myself.
It is very subtle with his messages, though.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
it definitely lays out the lyrics in like a digestible way, but like the actual meaning behind them, like it can take a few listens to actually
Right.
figure it out.
And it can because Isaac just be screaming and you can't
Yeah.
understand what he's saying and
Very
you have to
true.
look it up because
Well, I
it's
do
like
I love songs and albums that you have to like look into it to get the deeper meaning,
Right.
especially albums that have a lot of like just emotion behind them and like subjects like death, there's a lot of different ways to go about putting that into media. And I always think it's really interesting when an album can like have that, subtext and that kind of thing. And, you can listen to it and just jam to it, but then eventually you kind of get the meaning
Yeah.
to it.
Well,
Right.
even the name of the album kind of rings to that, right? It's really
Mhm.
subtle and it's like, right, you could sing about death and just like, have this very like either like vulgar depiction, or it could be like good news for people who love bad news. Like what does that really mean? And it's
right.
like, and with it, as we transition through the other interlude, which I think needs more than 3,000 listens.
I
Pretty
agree.
good.
Oh my god.
Dig Your Grave, stunning. I love it. This is when the strings come in. Yes. So I am a sucker for strings as well. Not only horns, but strings. And so this intro into Bury Me With It, I think that it just fits so perfectly and gets you into that vibe of like, oh, we're getting dark now. We're getting real dark now. And
I think kind of like the juxtaposition of the strings and with the tone, like how there's these like light strings across the entire album, but how that also feeds into like the darker tone. They
Mhm.
did it so well on this.
yeah,
song.
I agree. And then Bury Me With It is just that screechy, please bury me with it. Like, oh, it's something that I can scream down the highway and enjoy. I don't know about you guys, but I really like that track, especially for like its Louisiana Southern energy
Yeah.
that it's got to it. It's just a very, there's so many different instruments on this album, and I love that about it. There's accordion, there's banjo, there's definitely violin and strings of sorts like that in there, and then there's the horns, and just it gives jazz, backwoods, punk, indie rock all in one. It's really
Yeah, it's
great.
Yeah, this whole like middle section, it just like screams like what I said before. Like when I was first hearing it, the first thing that popped in my head was like Irish like sea shanties. Say that 5 times. And then, just like the heavy string bass and also the vocals on a lot of this. There's a lot of harmonies in a lot of the tracks. Sometimes they're like faint whispers, sometimes they're like more, actual like singing, like chord like structures, but throughout all of them, I couldn't help but just listening to the first time, wanting to listen, it felt like I was in this like wooden room that was like kind of like, medium sized, maybe some like tables and other people filling it, but it had this slight reverb to it where it made it cozy. I don't know why. I just felt like I had, a scotch with like very like warm lighting, little fire maybe.
Love that energy. And then it moves on from there to Dance Hall, which
That
I
was crazy.
love that song. Like love that
I have
song.
to disagree with you.
Really?
I have to disagree.
I see how it could get whiny and annoying at a certain point, but it just makes me want to stomp my feet and punch the air and jump around. And
I think like with this track they were trying to go for like an Elvis like early rock kind of vibe, you know, and I just felt like it kind of fell flat because I don't think they like put their own spin on it. They just yelled dance hall, dance hall.
Yeah. And then the dance hall, dance hall. Yeah, I love
It
it.
actually reminded me a lot of That Handsome Devil, which is also big during this time. Remember them? They were big into that kind of like, or even like La Dispute, very like aggressive, punchy, just like, out there vocals.
Yeah.
So I feel that. I feel that.
I get how it's give and take though. Many people like it, many people don't.
I mean, another issue I have with it is, I mean, what Matt was saying, like, I find a problem with, like, the exaggerated vocals in this one, just because I don't think there's, like, really any substance to them. I mean, I do like the exaggerated vocals in other tracks.
Right.
Though.
Yeah, he does have that in a lot of different tracks, and going from Dance Hall to Buckowski, I feel like there's a very strong sense of lyrical difference and lyrical substance to it. You know what I mean? Buckowski, probably my favorite track on the album, which is very hard to say, but I love it. It speaks to me in ways that I can't even explain, and I like the way that it was laid out from verses to chorus.
Yeah, let me tell you, if she could explain it, we'd be here till midnight.
Right. But I don't know if you guys had any opinions on that.
See, for me, a problem with me is since I was listening to it while I'm driving, I don't know about you guys, but I can like listen to the lyrics, I can hear like a chorus and be like, okay, that's what the song's about. But when it comes to the verses and like what they actually said, like, did they say this? I might have heard this. Also, my car speakers are kind of bad. So it's like, so for me, I more have listened to a lot of the instrumental stylings throughout. And from what I can remember, I think pretty much all the way from like Devil's Workday on, it was pretty much like, well, I mean, the middle section definitely had that, like I said, the Celtic vibe. But then it kind of went more, I don't say like softer, but definitely more back into the rock side with a Celtic vibe. So it's like they went rock, Celtic, and then a mix.
Yeah, I see that. I see that for sure. Getting from Buckowski to Devil's Workday, I feel like, once again, I really like the lyrical composition of this track. I think that it's interesting. And I put it on my Halloween playlist because it really just gives you such visceral and dark descriptions. Like, I'm going to crawl on my knees until they have no more blood to give. And, you're all floating down the river, Devil's Workday. It's a very dark and evil song, and it feels like something that could almost be in, I don't know if you've ever seen Over the Garden Wall.
Oh,
yeah. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so it feels like something that I could almost see being a part of Over the Garden Wall, and it gives me that energy of just like, this darkness that you can't even explain.
It's like almost like this like myth fairy tale kind of thing, because in a lot of songs like The Devil Went Down to Georgia, they paint this imagery of like bones coming out, making like bone like violins and strings. And you just really, you definitely get that in this.
Well, and good shout. I need some more songs to put on my my Halloween playlist.
Yeah,
I just got Monster Mash like 7 times. That's all I got so far.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the instruments, the instrumentals in this track like work into it so well. Like the baritone sax just sounds amazing, and like the blues style horns, like at the end, it sounds great. And I loved like the callback to the horn intro because I kind of felt like the horn intro was useless until I heard this song.
Right?
And I was like, wow, I kind of
Mm.
like that.
And it just comes in with that immediate beat. Are you dead or are
Yeah.
you sleeping? Are you dead? It's so good. It's
I really love when albums like tie back,
yeah.
yeah.
especially to
Mhm.
other songs. Just like, even more so songs that seem just kind of throwaway. I love that realization during an album when listening to it, when you're just like, I heard that. Like, I heard that in one of the first
Mhm.
songs, and then you start making connections.
Yes, definitely.
Very cool.
And then it takes it back and it goes to The View. And The View is another song on this album that I just absolutely love that brings down the energy for sure. I feel like it still has that Modest Mouse vibe, but it's like laid back a little bit more, and it has, once again, really great lyrical composition in my opinion. But overall, it's a really good song to place as number 10 in my opinion after all this darkness, and just give you a little break and then back to satin in a coffin.
Mhm.
Back to being real dark again. And just
But see, that's what's great about it, because as much as I mean, I definitely got the dark undertones, but for me, like listening to the actual music of it, I was more happy than anything.
Mhm.
Like I was just more like having a grand old time. Like, I mean, I definitely felt the somberness, but it wasn't like when I think of really depressing music, right? Like a black metal, a sludge kind of real heavy distortion. A lot of everything in this album was very clean for
That's
the most
really
part.
interesting.
What I admire about this track in particular is how that kind of somberness builds up, and then finally, like in the last like around 40 seconds, it finally comes into like full fruition. And there's
Mhm.
like just a bunch of instruments, like honestly, like futuristic synths are added in there, and
Mhm.
I think the bass like really drives it home.
oh yeah,
You know,
definitely.
yeah.
Yeah, and then the little interlude that they've got going again, which has a lot of views for some reason compared to the other interludes when
3 million
in
compared to
reality
3,000?
Wow.
in reality it's a baby cooing. I mean, come on now. What is this? I don't understand that part. I like it though. It gives it like sentimental value. It feels like you're stepping into a part of the band's life that you never knew was there, because they're always talking about these gritty and dark and indie rock things, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh wait, he's a father and he has
Well, and
a
there's that
child.
emotional impact,
And
right?
yeah.
That we talked about earlier.
Yeah, and it's like, oh, we're kind of connected to them in this way,
Mhm.
and they were vulnerable enough to put that out there and spread their child's voice out there for us. So I like that little part too. But it's not necessarily my favorite, on the
Yeah.
album.
No,
It's
for
just
sure.
a
For sure.
little quick interlude. And then once again, it's really dialed back to Blame It on the Tetons, which I love this track so much. It's something I could
I
fall
agree with
asleep
you, yeah.
to. It's what do you have to say about it?
I mean, I just gotta say that the piano chords are beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Like, probably some of the best I've heard on just like an indie rock album in general. I
Yeah.
mean, like the way it was all layered and the way it was set out, it's just like I think they knew they had something here, you know?
Yes.
Even if it's not one of their most like popular songs, like it is a defining example of their like artistic integrity.
Oh
you
yeah,
know?
definitely. A lot of people draw comparisons from The View to Blame It on the Tetons. I was noticing, and showing which one is more strong. A lot of people fell toward the side of The View, but I really do like Blame It on the Tetons. I think that it's like a really laid back and beautiful ballad, and that it was very valid. It was a valid ballad to put on this track.
And,
Nice
it's
one,
like, why do you
nice
gotta
one.
pick and choose?
Right.
It's like,
Why
you
you
know,
gotta pick
it's
and
on
choose?
it's on the same album. Like, there's sometimes like, oh, I'll put this album or this song on this album, but when you got the whole thing that's cohesive, this really pulling at hairs here.
Right. Yeah. And then it's back to Black Cadillacs. Let's talk more about death.
Let's do it.
Let's do it and bring back the explicit and make it dark again. And I like Black Cadillacs a lot, but I'd say it's one of the weaker tracks on the album. And in my opinion, it's not it's not necessarily my favorite. It's
Well, it's coming like late in the track list too. Which how
Right.
long is this album total?
it's about 48 minutes,
I
I
was gonna say,
believe.
is it still like a
It's
normal
a shorter album.
LP where it's
I'd say that's about
less
the
than an
sweet
hour.
spot for
Yep,
albums
48.
for me.
Yep.
48, 39 seconds. Yep.
It's like you have no idea how many times I have listened to an album and it's like an hour and 8, and you'd be like, oh, it's an extra 20 minutes. Oh, more music, but it's like it adds more that adds to my fatigue of it. It's like I want to be short, sweet, and exactly, like a perfect little thing with a bow on it. And definitely once you get towards the end of any album, you're really like, okay, how are you going to end this? How do you either keep me intrigued, or how do you really like finish it off?
Well, and
Mhm.
it really goes into like, sometimes you can say so much more with so much less.
Yeah.
Like you don't have to keep going and keep going and keep going. You can say a certain amount in a smaller amount of time, and sometimes it's more effective. And sometimes smaller albums do end up being like a lot more concise and a lot more like have a lot more connection just because of that. Like if you can make music effectively and connect to your audience in that short amount of time, then it speaks volumes to the quality of the music, I think.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I think musicians just need to realize that hour and a half hour albums are not needed all the time. Like, and like when you're seeing these like 2 hour, hour and a half albums, a lot of those tracks are just filler.
Right.
Kanye.
Kanye.
Yep.
Kanye.
And like it's
Kanye.
fine if you do need those tracks, but if you don't, then
Yeah, and we
you
were
know.
just talking about in the first half. We live in a day and age where I want the good stuff right now, and I want it to be catchy. And
Right.
I think of someone like Doja Cat, and I'm like, automatically, I'm gonna like your song because it's gonna be catchy, it's gonna be kind of sexy. But here we have, minus the little interlude tracks, like maybe include the Milo one. We only got 14 songs. 14 songs is a lot. I don't know about you, but as a fan of classic rock, it was like 8 to
Yeah.
10.
Yeah.
And it was, pretty much always that.
Right. And there's a variation in length for
Mhm.
songs too, which
Mhm.
is great about it too, because it's, you don't exactly know exactly when the next one's going to end and something else is going to begin, and give the
Yeah, and
the
like we're talking
vibe.
about indie, like they're playing with, okay, what works, what doesn't.
Right.
I'm okay making mistakes. I don't need this to be, cut paste. Oh, it needs to be this long. No, they're like, hey, you know what? If I want to do a little shanty song, if I want to pull some southern roots in, I'm gonna do
Right.
it. What are you
Mhm.
gonna tell me
Well, and
now?
also the change in tone, I mean, breaks it up a lot. And it sounds like, I mean, there's different like moods and different vibes that come with
Yes.
each song, and something that, will speak to a lot of different types of people.
Definitely.
And I mean, it is a cohesive album that's trying to say like a message like all the way through, but each song plays its part, and
Right.
it's saying a different part of that message.
That-
Which is
Definitely.
important for people who play it on shuffle.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so then we get back into the last two tracks with One Chance and The Good Times Are Killing Me. One Chance brings it right back, and it's almost like, to me, standing over a great big view, like on a cliff, and just looking out on this album and seeing what it is, one chance to get everything right. And it was, it's a really good second to last song in my opinion, because it brings it back and it gives you the energy of, we put a lot into this, we put a lot into this song, we put a lot into this album, and it meant a lot to us. And now we're gonna give you the last track, which is The Good Times Are Killing Me. And I really love that track. I love the little intro where you get to hear the band laughing around and
Yeah.
I love
and
that too.
goofing and gaffing and having a good time, and then it gives you that good fun last track that leaves you like smiling.
And it takes its time ending. 'Cause that's why ending tracks for me are the deal breakers for a good album. Because sometimes it will either drag on and on. Like I know one band I love is Star Effer.
Oh yeah,
And
they're very good. Yeah.
Very
their
good at that.
album, is it Miracle Mile? The last track is like 8 minutes long, and I love for how long it takes to really end. But I would be lying if I said at one point I was looking at my watch like, oh, is it? Or how long is left?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Whereas here, like, I was having a good time, and then they faded away, which also, I mean, let's be real, that adds to a lot of the message too.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Definitely.
I mean, and what I really like personally liked about this track was how reflective it was. Like,
yeah.
it was basically just like talking about how he was feeling like making this album, and just really looking back on it and considering like what he said and like his life in general, and which is I think is perfect for a final track.
Yeah, especially considering what was going on surrounding the release of this album. If you know anything about Isaac Rock, it was a real dark time in his life. Really, really dark time in his life. And I mean, there were obviously other band members involved in the creation of this album, so it's not all about him. But I think it was just such a bittersweet and beautiful ending to a beautiful, beautiful album, and one that I would recommend anybody listens to.
Really makes you sit on it too.
Yeah,
I'd
yeah,
honestly put that bittersweet label on the entire album.
yeah, definitely.
I mean, it's great all the way through, but there are times where it's gonna make you feel, you know,
Mhm.
and those emotions might not always be positive, but I mean, they do a good job of breaking it up where it always stays engaging and it's not just a bunch of sad songs in a row and then a bunch of like hard ragers in a row. It's like
Yeah.
I think the pacing of the album is very good as well.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Any
Well,
final thoughts? No, no,
I think
no.
you heard it from us, folks. That's our overall opinions going track by track of the album Good News for people who love bad news. And before we leave here, we're going to need our boss here, Chloe, to pull the next album that we're going to talk about out of a hat.
Woo! Oh
Give it up
yeah.
for Chloe. She's
Give it
gonna
up for
come out.
Chloe.
Yay.
Mine, please be mine, please be mine, please be mine. And the one that won is Do It All the Time. I don't know, but They Found Me by James. So it's your, or not by
Oh,
James,
by
but James
James.
chose it.
I
James did it
wrote
right,
it.
but
Self plug here.
All right.
All
I
right,
know this
funky,
album. It's a
very
good. It's a
cool.
good album. I'm
It's a fun
intrigued.
album.
Any little teaser for the audience here?
It's exciting, and I think that there's the potential for some strong opinions on it.
Oh, yeah.
Strong
I'm excited.
opinions. You know we
All
got
right.
them. All right,
Yeah.
folks. Make sure to check us out next week.